as we discussed in relation to the definition of disability itself. So substantial is more than minor or trivial. So placing a disabled pupil at a substantial disadvantage compared with their peers is relatively easy to do that. And we are required to make those reasonable adjustments in order that we do not place that disabled pupil at a substantial disadvantage. Now, that we touched on this in the first podcast. It means that we have to think ahead, because if we fail to make an adjustment and we do place that disabled pupil at a substantial disadvantage, we have discriminated. So we have to think ahead and prevent that substantial disadvantage. And that's one of the key things about the reasonable adjustments duty. So it does require thought, it probably requires some discussion, and we talked about the benefits of discussing it with disabled children, young people themselves, so that we're confident we're doing something that's going to work, if you like. But there is a range of ways in which this duty applies to the life of different educational institutions. There are three areas that are covered by the reasonable adjustments duty. And the main one, which applies to all educational schools, early years settings, to colleges, is adjustments to any provision, criterion, or practice. So that's really about the ways in which schools organise themselves, as written policies, its daily practices, whether they're codified in a policy or organise themselves. Now, the second requirement, because this is simply the way they're listed in the Equality Act, applies to alterations to physical features. Now, that particular element of the reasonable adjustments duty doesn't apply to schools. It does apply to early years settings and to FE colleges. Doesn't apply to schools. There is a separate requirement on schools, which I'd quite like to talk about in a bit more detail later, is the requirement to have an accessibility plan. And schools are not covered by the duty to make reasonable adjustments to physical features. They have, if you like, instead, they have this longer term strategic duty around increasing accessibility. And I'll say a bit more about that later. But that second requirement around alterations to physical features, reasonable adjustments duty, applies to early years and FE colleges, but not to schools. Then the third element in the reasonable adjustments duties is about reasonable adjustments to the provision of auxiliary aids and services. Now, that might be a reasonable adjustment providing a little bit of equipment. It might be about consulting a specialist service for some advice about how to adjust the environment for a disabled pupil. It might be a range of things, but there are, in this context, there are some considerations about what counts as reasonable that are relevant, because I can hear everyone thinking, well, surely the provision of an auxiliary aid is surely we make that through the SEN framework, don't we? The Children and Families Act requires that special educational provision. Isn't that where aids come in? Yes, quite right. And that is one of the considerations that can be taken into account when we're thinking about what is reasonable and what isn't reasonable. So I'll pause there, Tina, because I just want to be confident that we've covered those three different requirements and need to be really clear that that physical alterations reasonable adjustment doesn't apply to schools, but does to early years and FE. It's the other two for schools, the adjustments to any provision, criterion or practice, and the auxiliary aids and services adjustments that apply to schools. Then, let's see if you think that's sort of roughly clear or
No,
not.
I think
We're
no,
going to think about
I
what's
think it's
reasonable.
no, I think it's clear because this is a starting conversation. And as you've said, we've got the guides. We're going to put that on our YouTube channel. We'll put the links to the website as well within the podcast blurb. And I think, what's next, I think, is about what is reasonable.
Yeah.
And, some of the comments that we've had in our chats, well, not our chats, but the sort of, the ask from our potential audience, is around, what is reasonable, but also, looking at expectations from parents and families, around TA time or whatever, the parents are expecting as a reasonable adjustment. And, I understand, parents being the advocate for the child that they are, because they are, sometimes what we would describe as reasonable might not be reasonable to other people. So I think it's really important that we look at what's reasonable, and also touching on, we touched on episode 1 about where parents can go to have a conversation if they are worried that what's being provided is not reasonable and there's discrimination. So we can touch on that again. I know we sort of mentioned it in episode 1, the first episode of this particular subject. But what is reasonable, Philippa?